Wasp: Quantumania right around the corner, let's talk about the original Ant-Man from 2015. I did a review of it at the time of its release. I pretended to shrink myself down to the size of an ant. I haven't watched that video since then, but I just cringe at the thought of it. It was one of my really earlier years of reviewing stuff on this channel, so if you want to watch it, it's somewhere on there, last I saw. So Ant-Man is directed by Peyton Reed, starring Paul Rudd, Michael Douglas, Evangeline Lilly, Michael Pena, amongst other people, involving a crook named Scott Lang, who's dragged into the middle of this heist, orchestrated by Hank Pym, who wants to destroy the Pym particles that are going to be used for evil purposes by Darren Cross, who later becomes the Yellow Jacket. Hank has been watching Scott for a certain amount of time due to his skills of breaking and entering, and uses him as a pawn to get him inside his corporation and carry out his plan. I still remember the first time I heard that the Ant-Man movie was coming out, and just the thought of someone called Ant-Man. Thinking, that sounds like garbage. What are they doing? But we all once said a similar thing about Guardians of the Galaxy. We all thought it sounded stupid at the time with a talking tree, a talking raccoon. But now, all these years later, nobody questions it anymore. People have taken it very seriously, and the way they portray the character in the movie since this film's release, nobody finds it laughable. I certainly don't find it laughable either. I mean, the idea of a guy called Ant-Man who shrinks down to the size of an ant, on paper, that wouldn't sound that good, but the way they play it out here, I find it pretty reasonable and believable. A lot of that is obviously due to the way they portray this character through the writing and Paul Rudd's very, very entertaining performance throughout all these movies. But in the case of this movie, Scott Lang is finding himself in a very toxic cycle that he just can't seem to walk away from. He wants to reunite with his daughter Cassie, desperate to have a fresh start, but somehow keeps getting sucked back in when everything in the universe is completely stacked against him. Almost kind of reminds me of Peter Parker, where he just constantly gets pounded into the dirt. Scott Lang isn't necessarily an everyman per se. He is a normal, average, everyday man, as the way they portray him and how he responds to various things that he never really would have thought existed, like with the Avengers, the quantum realm, the shrinking technology, and all that stuff. But his past actions are obviously what most people would never consider doing. But in an act of desperation, with the information that's provided by his friend Louise, he decides to break into a house and stealing some really high-priced item at the possibility of earning a huge amount of money in order to pay for his child support and to prove to his ex and her husband that he's more than capable in doing whatever it takes to be a good father to his kid. I'd seen Paul Rudd in other movies before this, obviously, like 40-Year-Old Virgin, Role Models. He was also in the movie Anchorman, which I honestly never watched, and I don't really plan on doing so. Will Ferrell is not my slice of humor. I'm sorry if anybody out there is a fan. It's just not really my thing. Paul Rudd also had a special appearance in the Cider House Rules movie with Tobey Maguire, a movie that stars Ant-Man and Spider-Man and Alfred in the same movie. Basically, he's got a really good sense of comedy to him, and I think that this is probably his best outing that he's ever done as an actor, as far as I've seen at least. He's very charming, likable, and hilarious without becoming annoying. His reactions to all the wondrous things that he sees, someone like me would react the exact same way. And as opposed to the other characters in the MCU, like Captain America, who was a super soldier, or Bruce Banner, who turns into a giant green monster, or even Thor, who's a god, a demigod, Scott Lang is just a normal human being. No superpowers, no skill set of any kind besides breaking in and stealing stuff. He's just a guy. Similar to Matt Murdock and, heck, even Tony Stark. He just happens to have a set of technology that makes him look a lot stronger than he actually is. Another reason I think Scott Lang has resonated with audiences because of how normal he really is. Not just in his personality, but the physicality of his character too. He has to rely on technology to defeat his enemies. And his intellect and how he's able to break past certain security barriers. As for other characters, Michael Douglas as Hank Pym, he is the emotional center for this movie. His performance in here is terrific.
Terrific, that was terrific.
Hank is suffering from a huge amount of guilt over losing his wife many years ago. Stopping a Russian missile from hitting the United States, his wife decided to go subatomic in order to penetrate the bomb, but as a result, she never came back. Stuck somewhere in the quantum realm, which if you've seen the sequel, we all know how that turns out. But in the case of this movie, the fact that she never returned took a huge toll on Hank and his daughter Hope. Even though they are working together to stop Darren Cross, there's still a huge amount of tension between the two as she calls him by his name instead of Dad. And this, I think, serves as a motivation for Scott, since he doesn't want to see his daughter view him the same way as she does with Hank. Hope. That's what I meant. Hank in a lot of ways tells him, don't make the same mistakes I did. Don't let your daughter hate me like my own daughter hates me. I also like that we get to see that he was working for S.H.I.E.L.D. for Howard Stark back in the 1980s or 70s as well, which we saw that in Avengers Endgame when they go back to the 1970s and they steal the Pym particles with the de-aged Michael Douglas, and the same thing happens in this one. We'll talk about that later with the effects. I also really like the relationship that Scott has with his daughter Cassie, and Cassie is just so adorable, and kids in movies usually a lot of the times aren't that good because of their lack of experience, but here I think it's perfectly fine. And this moment here,
Daddy, is that you?
hi Peanut, that little smile she gives him, oh that does it for me. Oh my god, probably the best character in this movie besides Hank Pym and Scott Lang is Louise, played by Michael Pena. He is a riot. He's obviously the comedic bone of this movie, but the way he is able to tell a story on how he learns certain information in order to get Scott to know about what's going on, and how all the actors that are talking out these lines that he's reciting are all synced up the exact same way that he's saying it, it might be a little bit on the nose, but I think it works perfectly, especially at the end with the Stan Lee cameo. Even with a hint of Spider-Man showing later up, where they say we got a guy who swings from buildings and crawls on walls or whatever he says. I still remember at the time when I first heard those words, I freaked. We were way past the announcement of Spider-Man joining the MCU, and we were still waiting for some kind of a glimpse of Spider-Man to show up somewhere in the upcoming movies, which eventually later happened in Civil War, but just the fact that we were getting our first taste of it, it's kind of neat to see that little Easter egg in hindsight. And Scott, with his everyman quality, is able to ground the film significantly. Louise makes it even better with his own style of humor.
I'm in the system. The system?
Yeah, we're doomed.
Another case of how many times did they exactly have to do that without any of them laughing? Probably more times than they care to count. Oh, and the one guy who's the computer expert, he was Thomas Schiff in The Dark Knight, if you don't remember. Heads, you get to keep your head. Tails, not so lucky. You want to tell me about the Joker? This is the work of gypsies. Sorcery! But they all play a crucial part in breaking into the Pym headquarters in order to steal the technology that's created by Darren Cross. The training montages that we see Scott go through as he learns how to control the ants and learns how to use hand-to-hand combat with the help of Hope, this all comes to a head when Hope tries to get Hank to let her go onto the mission instead of Scott. And due to her anger towards her father over the fact that he wouldn't tell her about what happened to her mom, she allows herself to be blinded by that and almost jeopardizing the mission many times. Scott's able to talk her down by saying that he's expendable and that's why he's choosing her, and he doesn't want to lose her the same way that he lost her mom. Then Hank later reveals to her the truth about what happened, allowing the relationship to be mended. When it comes to Hope, honestly, I've never really been a big fan of hers. I got nothing against Evangeline Lilly. I think she plays the part fine. I don't know if it's really her or the character, but to me, she's just kind of there. She's just a basic love interest for Scott, and I don't really buy the fact that they would end up together romantically. I understand that she's dealing with a lot of emotions over her mother, but on my end, it's hard for me to connect with her as a person. As for the shrinking scenes, they are amazing. And what really makes them very effective is that everything in the foreground around Scott is in focus. Everything in the background is blurred out. That way you can't notice the uncanny valley or the imperfections of the CGI effects in the background. A lot of us have seen the movie Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, which for its time it had a good effect, but when you look back on it now, the effects probably don't hold up as well, and that's due to the limitations that they had at the time, so you kind of have to give it some leeway there. But in the case of this with Marvel's visual effects team, they were able to get it down superbly. Seeing Scott getting sucked into a vacuum cleaner with a Lego piece right next to him, running into a giant mouse, which to a normal-sized human being might freak you out, but it doesn't really seem that scary. But to someone who shrinks down to the size of an ant,
You better run, squirrel!
not to mention the de-aging effects on Michael Douglas in the opening scene, when I saw this in the theater at the time, I thought, oh. The mouth looks slightly off, and to be fair, de-aging technology is not the easiest thing to do. But Marvel's visual effects team, I don't know how exactly, but somehow they have a formula that works for them. Looks the exact same way that he did back when he did Wall Street in the 1980s. As far as the opening scene involving S.H.I.E.L.D., stuff like that is a necessary evil, and a lot of people have complained over the years. There's too much interconnectivity, you need to be more standalone. But I think in this case it's perfectly fine. I think it would make sense for Hank Pym to work for S.H.I.E.L.D., and since Howard Stark was one of the co-founders of S.H.I.E.L.D., shield, trying to fight certain adversaries like Hydra or the KGB, you would need someone with Hank Pym's intellect to fight their enemies. And I guess you could say in a way Hank Pym's story is very similar to Captain America and Iron Man. Someone who was a super soldier or an elite type of warrior who fought against various people through certain periods of time, disappeared for many years and returned to the modern world, similar to Captain America, and someone who's using his intellect in order to try to stop the technology that he sees as dangerous in the hands of the wrong people. Iron Man, anybody? It's not that big of a deal, and I don't really see it as a problem. It's a formula that Marvel's come to do by now, so whether or not you think that's a problem, well, that depends on who you are as a person. Myself, I don't really think it is. Just something that I picked up on. I've also noticed this with the lasers that the Yellow Jacket fires. The sounds that it makes sounds very similar to the AT-AT walkers in The Empire Strikes Back, or the AT-STs. Imperial walkers in the original Star Wars trilogy. And since Disney bought Lucasfilm at the time and Star Wars Episode 7 was coming up, I guess that was their subtle way of letting people know, yeah, we got Star Wars now. Probably sounding like a reach. It's a nice detail either way that they threw in there. As for Darren Cross, this was a common thing that we were seeing in the Infinity Saga at the time. The villains were pretty underdeveloped or not that interesting. Well, for the most part at least. Corey Stoll, I think, has that look where you could see him as an antagonist.
You're a nice guy, but let's face it, you're a little scary. As a matter of fact, you're scaring me right now. Your face is very red. Are you even breathing? Is he breathing?
But he's not really given a whole lot to do here, and they do mention a backstory with him and Hank, and how he was his student, and how he felt betrayed when Hank wasn't telling him certain things. But they don't really go into that, and his motivations for wanting the Yellow Jacket technology don't really have much to say about it, because I didn't really care. But I do like the final fight scene that he has with Ant-Man at the climax, all on a little toy train set of Thomas the Tank Engine, which, a show that I watched religiously when I was a kid. I found it a little bit funnier in the trailer, but still, this moment always makes me laugh. But then we get a trippy scene when the Yellow Jacket is defeated and Ant-Man ends up going into the quantum realm when he's told not to touch a certain type of technology in his suit, and he ends up doing that anyway, and he's stuck in this really weird space where time has no type of flow to it. Watching that scene a few nights ago, I forgot just how scary and trippy that moment was. Hearing the echo of Cassie calling out to her father, Scott remembering the words that Hank said to him about this place, I found it very haunting. And then he just so happens to have a ring that brings him back to his normal size. Another convenience, but the MCU's full of that stuff. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been back in the future movies anyway. But I really like how that plays into Hank realizing that his wife might still be alive, since Scott was able to come back from the quantum realm. Seeing Hank look at his picture and say, is it possible? I remember at the time thinking, okay, if he survived, then that means his wife is still out there somewhere, which obviously turned out to be true in retrospect. But we'll get to that later. Oh yeah, and as far as Edgar Wright being removed from the project before this film's release, there was a huge outcry from film fans and from Edgar Wright fans when he announced that he was not going to take part in the Ant-Man production. I do remember certain YouTubers that I watched at the time and how upset they were, and they decided to boycott the movie. I understood what they were coming from, and I still sympathize with that to a certain degree, but at least to my knowledge anyway, he hasn't really said anything bad about Marvel. I think he's made it clear that, look, we weren't on the same page, we had different intentions, but inevitably we decided that it wasn't really going to work, and that they needed someone who was going to play in their ballpark, quote unquote. But I do like how they gave him original credit for the story aspect at least, and I think there's some things, like in this particular shot right here where Ant-Man is on the top of this pistol and he's kicking the crap out of these guys. I think the way they shot that scene, or that sequence, maybe that was an Edgar Wright thing that they decided to keep in the final cut of the movie. But there's also other things that, like when it cuts to Scott running towards the door, trying to jump through the keyhole, and then it cuts back to the other side of the door, kind of reminds me of something that Edgar Wright would do in his movies. I see it as like a nice little nod to Edgar Wright and what he had in mind for the story, so I don't really think there's any bad blood between the two. Plus, you don't really hear many people talking about it now, I think in the years since then, so I don't really see what the point of all that outrage was, but I say that a lot about certain controversies anyway, so. Would I like to have seen what Edgar Wright would have done? Sure, absolutely. But if it wasn't going to fit Kevin Feige's blueprint, necessarily, then maybe it was best to get someone who was going to play by his rules, while also doing their own thing at the same time. I don't know if I put the first Ant-Man in my top 5 MCU films, but if I had to put him in the top tier, it would be somewhere in the top 10. Or the top 15 at least. It's got a nice blend of emotional weight and humor to it without it overriding the film too much, especially with Michael Pena. And due to the smaller stakes of the situation, it's refreshing to see a film that's not dealing with some kind of world-impending doom or another beam-in-the-sky type of battle. It was this movie, along with Captain America Civil War, that finally managed to break that trend. But yeah, the original Ant-Man is a really good time, and I think it's something that anybody of any age can enjoy. Oh my god, I keep forgetting other stuff to mention. Had a really long day, I'm kind of tired, so just bear with me here. The fight scene between him and the Falcon, from a fanboy standpoint, just made me full of satisfaction. First off, I'm a big fan. Appreciate it. So who the hell are you? All the more reason why Falcon decides to recruit Ant-Man for the airport battle in Civil War, which we get a setup for in the mid-credits scene. So those are my thoughts on the original Ant-Man. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are on this movie. And do you prefer this movie or its sequel? Well, I should probably ask that when I get to the review of the second one. Either way, just comment below and tell me what your thoughts are, and I'll see you in the next one.